Hello everybody, how's it going? It's Timothy here with Mana Rocks, and we're going to go ahead and continue our Ikoria limited archetype breakdown, this time looking at the Mutate mechanic and the types of decks you can build using the new mechanic. It is an extremely complicated mechanic. In fact, besides maybe Meld, it might be the most complicated mechanic that I've ever played with. And while we're going to go and walk through the general steps on how to mutate a creature and what you should watch out for, just note that there are a lot of corner cases with this mechanic, and it's worth reading up on it before you play in your first couple events, just to kind of get an idea of what to watch out for. But that's the game plan for today. We've already covered the mechanic counters, or the keyword counter archetypes. We've covered cycling and the blue-red spells deck. Today we're going to hone in on just mutate decks, what to watch out for, some quick tips on it, and basically how to order your mutate creatures. And note that this isn't specifically an archetype, but it does fall into a specific color combination, and we'll talk about that a little later in the video. As always, if this has been helpful in any way, shape, or form, if you've learned something, if it's been informative, feel free to subscribe below just to show support. And if not, that's cool. We're just hanging out. You can also find us on Twitter at MTG_ManaRocks. And what do you say we jump into this and talk about Mutate? We've got quite a bit to talk about for just a single mechanic. So just a quick overview on how Mutate works. If you're maybe a new player, or maybe you haven't really read up on the rules, interactions, and stuff like that, let's go ahead and talk about it. So let's say I've just got a creature on board, and yes, you will have to have a creature on board in order to mutate your creatures, and it has to be a non-human creature, which is in the reminder text of Mutate itself. But I've got a creature on board, and in my hand, I have a creature with Mutate. Now, I can just cast Porcupine as normal as a 4-mana 3/4 that taps and doesn't really do anything because it hasn't mutated. But wouldn't it be really cool if I could give that untap ability to Porcupine and keep tapping it, keep activating its ability over and over again? Well, Mutate lets you do that. So Mutate is an alternative casting cost. That means when you cast it, it's still a creature. You're still casting it from your hand. You're doing all that normal stuff as if you were just casting it as a card in your hand. It's just an alternative casting cost, and it's usually cheaper. Sometimes it's more expensive, but in most cases, the mutate cost is about a mana less than the actual casting cost of the creature, which means you're getting kind of a discount, but you're also setting yourself up for 2-for-1s, which we'll talk about later. But the way it works is when you mutate, you target one of your creatures, non-human creatures, and when the mutate resolves, assuming you didn't get a removal spell cast on you in response or anything like that, you're going to make a choice on whether to put the mutate creature on top of the target or underneath the target. So you have the option to put Porcupine on top of Glimmerbell, and what that means is the top card, whatever one you choose to put on top, is going to dictate the power and toughness of the card, also all the other characteristics like color, converted mana cost, name, so on and so forth, creature type, things of that nature are all dictated by the top card, but you will basically gain the abilities of the bottom card. So we see if we put Porcupine on top, we have a 3 and a red, 3/4, that taps to deal X damage to any target, equal to the number of times it's mutated at this point once. And it has flying, and you can pay 1 and a blue to untap it. So even though it says untap Glimmerbell, it just refers to whatever the current card is, the combination of cards. So you've got a tapper that can deal damage to anything, at least 1 damage at this point, and you can pay 2 mana to untap it, which is a little bit of a wombo combo, right? Porcupine's kind of cool. Now, you also have the option, which is probably the lesser of the two options, to put Glimmerbell on top and put the mutate creature underneath the target. And what this results is the same suite of abilities. You still have a tapper that can deal damage to any target. You can still pay 1 and a blue to untap it. It still has flying. No matter which order you put the creatures in, whether you put the mutate card on top or bottom, you're still going to have the same combination of abilities. The difference is that the power and toughness will be drastically different in most cases, and the color, mana cost, all that good stuff, creature type, is all going to be different. So in the second case, we put the Porcupine on the bottom, we actually end up with a worse creature, right? We have a 1/3 with all the same abilities as opposed to a 3/4 with all the same abilities. And that means more often than not, basically 99% of the time, you are going to put the creature with the higher power and toughness on top, unless there is something specifically on board that cares about power, toughness, color, creature type, which there's really not going to be a lot of that floating around in this set. So in layman's terms, if you want to go ahead and just have a rule of thumb, put the creature with the higher power and toughness on top, which should be pretty obvious. Now, either way, you end up with the same suite of abilities like we said, but there's still choices, right? You can continue to mutate onto that creature. So right now we have our Porcupine. It has flying, it can untap itself. It's kind of a combo. Every 2 mana lets me untap it to tap it again and ping something. Let me say I want to make that a little bit stronger, right? Because Porcupine says it deals damage equal to the number of times it's mutated. Well, why don't we go ahead and mutate it again, so now it starts dealing 2 damage per tap instead of 1 damage. I have in my hand a Glowstone Recluse. This card is basically a 3 mana 2/3 reach, but it has mutate, and it says whenever this creature mutates, put 2+1/+1 counters on it. Now, I'm going to get a lot of bonuses here, right? And I have the same choice. When I mutate and I pay 4 mana, 3 and a green, to mutate, targeting my Porcupine, and it resolves, I have a choice of putting the Glowstone Recluse on the bottom. Now, I can do that, right? And Glowstone Recluse will trigger because that ability is shared by the entire stack of creatures. It says whenever this creature mutates, put 2+1/+1 counters on it, so my Porcupine will gain 2 counters. It will now have reach, but it'll still be a base 3/4, right? Because I put the Glowstone Recluse on the bottom. So altogether, now I have a 5/6 with reach and flying for the Wombo combo. It can untap itself for 1 and a blue, and it taps to deal 2 damage to any target creature or player, any target, right? I can also put that Recluse on top if I really want to, in which case it'll still trigger, it'll get 2+1/+1 counters, but now I'll have a 4/5 reach instead of a 5/6 flying reach. It'll have all the same abilities, it can still do all the tapping, but it'll just be a lower power and toughness. So if you're adding a creature to a stack of mutate creatures you already have, most likely you're going to put it on the bottom unless it trumps the power and toughness of the card on top. Already very complicated. This is going to play very well in digital. It's going to look very sloppy in paper, but that is just the mechanic we have to work with. And you might ask yourself, why would I keep mutating onto the same creature if I'm not going to change its power and toughness? If the card on top is already stronger than the card I'm adding to the mutate stack, why would I keep investing resources in this same creature instead of starting some other mutate creature? And that's a good question. The main answer is because you add abilities, right? Porcupine gets better the more times you mutate onto it, but you incur more risk the more times you mutate onto it, because if your opponent kills your mutate creature, you lose the entire thing. It doesn't separate or anything like that. If you have 3 creatures in a stack and they use a removal spell, you put all 3 of those cards in the graveyard. So even though it functions a little bit like Bestow when you're casting it, if you cast it and your opponent kills the target in response, you just get the creature as normal. It doesn't get any mutate triggers. It just pops out as its own creature. That is not how Bestow worked when the creature died while it was attached, right? You would still get the creature. This case, you lose the entire stack. So be a little bit careful about how many times you keep bestowing onto the same card if you suspect your opponent's going to be able to deal with it. Now, a couple quick tips here that are just things to keep in mind while you're playing either with mutate cards or against mutate cards. The first thing is, if you're in a mutate deck and you know that your whole deck is based around mutating as many times as possible, you want to avoid drafting humans, and that's because mutate does not work with humans. Again, it's in the rules text of the mechanic that you cannot target a human creature, right? And none of the humans in this set have mutate or anything funky like that. So I would try to stay away from as many human creatures as possible, which is a little bit hard because there are also payoffs in this set that care about having humans. So you might have to find a dividing line between what your strength line. If your mutate cards are way better than your humans matter cards, then I would just stay shy of the humans altogether. And there's no shortage of creatures that aren't humans in this set, so it's not exactly hard to put together a deck that doesn't care about humans. Second thing, you might put a little more value in the 1-drops in this set, and this goes for the 2-drops as well. And the reason I say that is because the mutate cost, again, is often cheaper than the casting cost of the creature. So the sooner you can mutate, the better, but you can't mutate unless you have a target on board. So these creatures that have 2 mana mutate costs or 3 mana mutate costs, you want to get them down ideally as early as possible, and that means you need a creature down as early as possible to mutate onto. That means a 1-drop fills an actual role here. Now, I want to just go ahead and caveat this and make a little statement that a bad 1-drop is still a bad 1-drop. Don't go drafting a vanilla 1/1 for 1 mana because you need 1-drops. It still needs to do something. But the cool thing is, the 1-drops might be able to get a few points of damage in before you mutate, and they add their abilities to the creature that you're mutating onto them. So if you are a heavy mutate deck and you want to get your stack going as quick as possible, make sure you get some 1-drops in your deck. Make sure they do something, and don't stay shy. Don't shy away from your 2-drops either. They're pretty important in this format. A lot of the mutate cards start at 3+ mana, but there are 1 or 2 that start at 2 mana. And again, as soon as you can get those down, the faster you'll get your game plan going. Next, be wary of playing bounce spells against mutate creatures, because again, whatever happens to the stack happens to each individual card, right? If I use a kill spell on your mutated creature and it's got 2 creatures underneath it, I kill the entire stack. The entire thing goes to the graveyard. But if I use a bounce spell on your creature and it's got 2 creatures mutated underneath it, I bounce that back to your hand, the entire stack, so each individual card goes back to your hand, which means I basically put 3 cards back in your hand, which might actually end up being an advantage for you, because now you can rearrange how you want to cast those cards. You can cast them all individually, so you basically got a 3-for-1 off of my bounce spell. You can remutate them for enter the battlefield effects or mutate triggers and stuff like that. So just be a little bit careful. I expect bounce spells to be in this weird, awkward spot in this format where you will play a decent amount of them. They are going to be good as a response to just dealing with anything that's getting out of control, but there is going to be a little bit risk in casting them against mutate creatures because they are going to put those cards back in their hand individually and give them more options to replay them. Also, this is kind of an interesting thing that I think we'll learn as the format goes on, but I'm suspecting if you want to kill your opponent's creature, let's say they have 1 creature on board, and you suspect that they might want to mutate their next turn, you should probably just kill their creature at sorcery speed so they don't have the option to mutate. Remember, if your opponent has a creature on board and they cast a mutate card targeting it, you have the option to kill that creature in response, but they're still going to get something. So if you kill their creature, they never get the option to cast the mutate ability in the first place, right? They never get to use the alternative casting cost if they have no creatures on board. So they either have to wait to get another creature on board, or they just have to cast it straight up, which is usually not quite as good. So if your opponent has a creature on board and you have a kill spell and you plan on killing that creature, you should not get too tricky. You should just kill it basically as soon as possible so that you deny your opponent the option to mutate a creature. Look at something like the Porcuparrot, right? If it's turn 3 and my opponent has a creature on board and I'm deciding whether to cast Easy Prey to kill their creature, I'm just going to go ahead and do it, because as soon as I pass back to my opponent's turn 3, they can mutate. Whereas if I kill their only creature that they could mutate onto, they don't even have the option of casting the Porcuparrot anymore because they have to pay full price for it. So, again, try to use your removal at sorcery speed. This is not a hard and fast rule. It's just something to keep in mind when playing against mutate cards, that it might be better to just not hold on to a removal spell and try to trick your opponent and get them at instant speed. It might be better to just go ahead and throw your removal out there and kill their possible mutate targets. And then finally, if you are playing mutate, you need some way to protect your own creatures. There are a couple cards in this set that can make things indestructible or counter spells that target your own stuff. Mutate is going to be a double-edged sword. You get extremely powerful cards very quickly. You get these awesome triggers, but you are putting a lot of eggs in one basket. All of your resources are kind of going into this single creature, and if that creature gets dealt with, you fall behind very quickly. So cards like Keep Safe, there's a couple, again, indestructible instants and stuff like that. They're going to be quite powerful, or at least they're going to be necessary options for your mutate deck. Next up, I want to go ahead and go through what I consider to be the best mutate creatures, and this is a little awkward because the best mutate creatures are the majority of the mutate creatures. I'm not going to talk about every single mutate creature in this set, but I will be talking about the ones that give you some sort of advantage. Again, mutate is a double-edged sword. You are putting a lot of your resources into one card. Even mutate in a single time means you're putting 2 resources into a single card, and if your opponent deals with it, they're dealing with 2 cards for the price of 1, so you're setting yourself up for easy 2-for-1s in your opponent's favor. So the way we offset that is by looking for mutate creatures that give us something when we mutate it, right? If I can get a card's worth of value off of my mutate trigger, then it's worth it, because if the opponent deals with it, I already got a card back. It kind of mitigates the 2-for-1 nature of the mechanic. So we're going to go through basically every mutate creature in this set that can give you a 2-for-1 advantage and help kind of offset the danger of setting your opponent up for an easy 2-for-1. Now, I'm not going to read every single one of the Apex creatures, but they are the best mutate creatures in the set. They're kind of absurd, unfairly balanced cards meant for like constructed and stuff like that. And with the exception of Brokos, they all have these kind of absurd, repeatable mutate clauses that are just ridiculous. Plus, they're all perfectly fine creatures that just cast without mutate. So just know, if you open one of these, pack one, pick one, you should be playing it. And again, I think Brokos is the weakest of this cycle, but it's still a pretty absurd card, right? It doesn't actually give you value for mutating, it just lets you continue to mutate over and over again from the graveyard. The other ones are all kind of insane. If you have them, play them. It doesn't really matter what the abilities do, they're all kind of broken. But moving into cards I want to talk about individually, we'll go ahead and start off with Trumpeting Gnar, and there are, I believe, 2 mutate creatures here that make tokens when you mutate. So again, if that token is a card's worth of value, then yeah, feel free to go ahead and mutate. Now, Trumpeting Gnar, 1 blue-green for a 3/3. There are a lot of 3-mana 3/3s in this set. The mutate cost is actually very expensive compared to the casting cost. It's 3 and double blue-green hybrid mana, so 5 mana total. That's actually a jump in 2 mana from just casting this to mutate in it. But whenever this creature mutates, create a 3/3 green beast creature token. And just a reminder, when a card says, quote, whenever this creature mutates, end quote, it doesn't matter whether you end up with that card on the bottom or the top of the stack, you're going to get that trigger. So a lot of times you'll actually put this on the bottom. You know, a 3/3 might not be better than what you already have on board by turn 5, but you get a 3/3 beast creature token whenever it mutates, which is very powerful, right? That means if you're casting this and you're mutating onto it, you're creating a relevant token every single time you mutate. So again, your opponent might 2-for-1 you, but you kind of made up for that by making a relevant creature every time you mutated. So it kind of risk reward, it balances out over the course of the game if your opponent manages to deal with your Trumpeting Gnar. There is also Cub Warden, the other token maker, which is quite absurd. It's 3 and a white for a 3/5 lifelink rare cat. Already a very powerful card. You don't really care about the mutate here. You would already play a 4-mana 3/5 lifelink. And it says whenever this creature mutates, create 2 1/1 white cat creature tokens with a lifelink. So again, you want to mutate onto this over and over again and just build up a huge board of cats. The mutate cost is 2 white, so already pretty cheap, even though it is basically the same converted mana cost as the actual card. Cub Warden is very powerful. Trumpeting Gnar is very powerful. These are just strong cards to continue to mutate on because you generate board presence every time you do it. You ideally are probably getting other benefits off of it as well. Just keep in mind, every time you mutate onto something, you're probably getting multiple benefits, because just look at the 2 creatures we have here. If I mutate one onto the other, I get both triggers, which is pretty absurd when you think about it. Cub Warden, Trumpeting Gnar seem like very powerful cards in this format to me. Now the next category is cards that basically draw you a card or give you another resource. Sea Dasher Octopus is 1 blue for a 2/2 flash creature, and it says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. But the unique thing about Sea Dasher Octopus is that it has mutate for 1 and a blue, which aside from one other card, I believe that we're not going to talk about here, this is the cheapest mutate creature in the entire set as far as the actual mutate cost goes. That means if you have your 1-drop and you get to mutate on turn 2, you already have an engine going. You just need to protect it, make it bigger, do something so that it can keep getting in there and keep drawing you cards. Again, cheap mutate costs can get out of hand very quickly if you're able to protect them. And if you go 1-drop into 2-drop Sea Dasher Octopus, you're probably in a good spot. Not to mention it's just a good card to cast on its own, which is a theme you will see throughout a lot of the mutate creatures, is that, yeah, mutate gives you a pretty nice benefit, but a lot of these creatures are just fine individual creatures without mutate. Dreamtail here, Heron. Heron? I don't know. Dreamtail Heron is 4 and a blue for a 3/4 flyer, and whenever it mutates, draw a card. The mutate cost is 3 and a blue. So another card that can repeatedly draw you cards. Basically, every time you mutate onto this, you go down a resource, you invest a resource into the Heron, but you get to recoup that by drawing a card. So this is just straightforward mutate, draw a card, replace a card with a card. So just a 1-for-1 every time you mutate, and you get to make this flying threat that can turn into an engine later in the game. Migratory Greathorn, very similar, but instead of drawing a card, you get to search for a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped. This is just an early beater. The mutate cost is 2 and a green. You can also cast this as a 4-mana 3/4 with the same text. But being able to go 2-drop into turn 3 Migratory Greathorn means that A, you're rampant, so you can start casting your other stuff quite early. You can mana fix, and you get to start bashing with a 3/4 on turn 3, which is pretty gnarly when you think about it. The next set of cards here are all gold cards. There is a cycle of, I believe, enemy-colored gold cards here that have mutate abilities that all kind of give you some, reasonably powerful advantage and have hybrid mutate costs. Lord Draxus, 1 blue-red for a 2/3. The mutate cost is 2 Izzet mana, and this one gives you an instant or sorcery back from your graveyard when it mutates. Necropanther is 1 white-black for a 3/3, another 3-mana 3/3. The mutate cost is 2 and double Orzhov mana, so 4 mana total. This one's actually more expensive to mutate than to cast. This one gives you a creature with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard straight to the battlefield. And then there's Boneyard Lurker, which is 2 black-green for a 4/4. 4 mana 4/4, quite powerful. And the mutate cost is the same converted mana cost, but gives you hybrid options. It's 2 double Golgari, so 2 mana and 2 blue, black or green in any combination. This one returns any permanent from your graveyard to your hand when it mutates. So all of these cards they're flexible due to their hybrid mana cost. That means a card like Lord Draxus doesn't necessarily have to be in a blue-red deck, because you could play blue-blue for its mutate cost. They're all fine creatures to cast and then mutate onto later, and they all give you a card's worth of value when you trigger their mutate clause, so they kind of make up for the 2-for-1 nature of the mechanic. Again, we're going to say that a lot. Next category are what I consider to just be kind of the best mutate creatures that don't necessarily draw you a card, but give you something in exchange for mutating. Auspicious Starix is just a very powerful card. It's 4 and a green for a 6/6, and that's just its vanilla value, which is a card that you'd be very happy to play already. The mutate cost is 1 mana more expensive. It's 5 and a green, but it says whenever this creature mutates, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile X permanent cards, where X is the number of times this creature is mutated, and put those permanents onto the battlefield. It's a little bit hit or miss, right? You could just flip a land and put it on the battlefield, but you could also flip another giant creature and just cheat it into play, and you do that all just by mutating this creature. Remember, you don't necessarily have to mutate this onto something else. You can already have this on the battlefield and just mutate something else onto it, which is very powerful. And this triggers again when you mutate a second time, which means you're going to flip 2 permanents and put those on the battlefield. I find it hard to imagine you play this card, you mutate it, you get a permanent, and then you mutate it again and get 2 permanents. I find it hard to imagine that you're losing that game. Just very powerful, and again, you have the option of casting it as just a 5-mana 6/6, which is kind of incredible. There's also Everquill Phoenix, which is kind of in a category all itself. It's kind of a busted rare. It's 2 red for a 4/4 fly-in creature. It's a rare Phoenix. Already 4 mana 4/4 flyer. Sign me up. It has mutate for 3 and a red, so same converted mana cost to mutate. And it says whenever this creature mutates, create a red artifact token named Feather with 1 mana, sacrifice Feather, return target Phoenix card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. And what this means is, if you mutate this creature, you basically get an artifact that gives you a one-shot effect of just putting that creature back on the battlefield. And then if the Phoenix comes back and you mutate onto it again, because it'll be on the battlefield, you won't have the option to mutate it onto something else. But if you mutate onto the Phoenix, you make another Feather token, which can then bring the Phoenix back once more. It's just this kind of loop, and every time you mutate onto it, you get this kind of suspended artifact that lets you basically cash it in for another Phoenix later in the game, which is extremely powerful. Basically, every mutate creature turns into another 4/4 Phoenix if your opponent is able to deal with it the first time. Now, the Other category of cards, or the other subset of cards, are things that kind of interact with your opponent, right? We've seen all of these mutate cards that give you something when you mutate. Now we want to look at the mutate cards that take away something from the opponent or interact with them. Probably the most powerful one being Dirgebat. This is probably just the most powerful non-mythic mutate creature in the set, especially if you mutate onto it multiple times. It is, on its base, 2 black for a 3/3 flash flyer, already very good. Its mutate cost is 4 black, so 6 mana, but whenever you mutate this creature, whenever this creature mutates, destroy target creature or planeswalker in opponent's control. So, again, you recoup that cost of putting all your eggs in one basket, which we've said 1,000 times, by just straight up killing your opponent's best creature whenever you mutate. And it's repeatable. If you keep mutating onto this, you're going to keep killing your opponent's best creature. It basically turns every mutate card in your hand into a kill spell, even though it's a little expensive to get going, right? But keep in mind, you can cast this for 4 mana and then mutate onto it with cheaper cards, turning your cheap mutate creatures into kill spells. You don't necessarily have to pay the 6 to mutate this onto something to get the train rolling, so there's some flexibility there as well. Maybe a little bit of a step down, we have Pounce and Shore Shark, which we've talked about, another flash mutate creature. In this case, 4 and a blue for a 4/3. The stats aren't great on this one. It does mutate for a little bit cheaper at 3 and a blue, and this is just a bounce spell. When it mutates, you may return target creature and opponent controls to its owner's hand. So again, we talked about the risk of bounce spells in this format. I don't know how it's going to play out yet. I imagine they're still fine to play, but there's a little bit of danger in doing so. Pounce and Shore Shark seems fine, and it is a way to interact with your opponent at instant speed and do it repeatably if you're able to continue mutating onto the Shore Shark. There's Chitter and Harvester, which is 5 and a black for a 4/6. Not a great vanilla creature. The mutate cost is cheaper at 4 and a black, and this one makes your opponent sacrifice a creature whenever it mutates. Could be pretty poor against some decks, as Edict effects often are unlimited, especially since this mutates a little later in the game, and your opponents are often going to have human tokens and stuff like that laying around, but there are still benefits to making your opponent lose tokens, and sometimes they have to lose actual creatures. There are a lot of times that cards like this just get carried away, and your opponent is not able to keep up, right? You mutate, they have to sack a creature, you attack. You mutate, they have to sack a creature, you attack. I don't know that every game is going to play out that way, but it is an option, so we still want to give the card a shout out. Cavern Whisperer is up next. This is kind of the analog to the Dreamtail Heron or whatever it was called. It's 4 and a black, not analog, but opposite, I suppose. 4 and a black for a 4/4 menace creature. It's a common nightmare. It has mutate for 1 cheaper, 3 and a black, and whenever it mutates, your opponent discards a card. Now, in most cases, I would rather have the one that draws me a card rather than the one that makes my opponent discard a card, because A, drawing a card is always great. Sometimes making your opponent discard a card doesn't usually do anything. Your opponent can play around it. They see it on board. They're able to sandbag extra lands, or sometimes they just don't have extra cards in their hand. But this is a 4/4 menace, which is a reasonable body, and it does have a relevant ability, even if it's not quite as good as the one that draws you cards. There's Gemrazor. This one is a rare. We've talked about it in a couple other videos. It's 3 and a green for a 4/4. Again, format of 4/4, you're perfectly happy playing. The mutate cost is 1 GG, so 3 mana to mutate this. It has reach and trample because it needed more relevant keywords, and when it mutates, destroy an artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. This is not a set where artifacts or enchantments are prevalent. In fact, there are very few artifacts that are worth even going out of your way to destroy, and not very many enchantments, although there are a couple. Especially the rare cycle of enchantments. But Gemrazor is just a good set of stats for your mutate creature, and it could be repeated naturalizes against an opponent who is running a couple artifacts or enchantments. And there's Porcuparrot. Porcuparrot, I think, is a little bit more of a combo card, right? If you're able to stick Porcuparrot on a Death Toucher and then activate its ability, you can just use it to ping down creatures and kill creatures basically every single turn, which is kind of insane. Also works nicely with the Untapper that we saw at the beginning of this video. Not one of the premium cards unless you do have combos to go with it, but does seem like a pretty strong addition to the set and does have the capability of sniping down tokens if it's only mutated once. And that leads us to A different question. Okay, so we know what the good mutate cards. What are we mutating onto? Are we just supposed to keep mutating onto our best creature over and over again? Well, you can do that, but there are creatures that were designed in this set to be kind of the base creature that you start with, and then the creature that you target with mutate. I don't really know what the better word is here, but I'm just calling them bases. Basically, the creature you already have on board that you're targeting with a mutate ability that's going to give you some sort of extra ability whenever you mutate. And note that this is where the Sultai kind of color identity comes into play here. Mutate is in every color, but most of the payoffs are centered in the Sultai color. So first off, we have Essence Symbiote. This is 1 in a green for a 2/2 common beast, and it says whenever a creature you control mutates, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature, and you gain 2 life. And notice this one does not say it has to mutate or whenever you mutate onto this. It's just if this is sitting on board, and you happen to mutate onto anything else, that creature is going to get a little bit bigger and you're going to gain a little bit of life. Seems like a nice addition to the deck. And again, the deck doesn't mind 2-drops. You really want some 1s and 2s. Essence Symbiote seems like a perfectly good 2-drop to me. Zagoth Mamba is a single black mana. Again, look for your 1-drops in this deck. It is an uncommon 1/1 Nightmare Snake, and it says whenever this creature mutates, target creature an opponent controls gets -2/-2 until end of turn. So repeatable removal if you're able to mutate onto it. And unlike the Essence Symbiote, you do actually have to target the Mamba with the mutate ability in order to trigger it, whereas the Symbiote can just be sitting on board if you mutate onto something else. -2/-2 is probably still good enough to warrant a mutate. This doesn't give you any particular benefits if you don't have mutate cards, so keep it to your mutate deck, but it does seem like a nice little payoff, or at least a nice starting point to get your mutate cards going. And then there's Polywog Symbiote, which is 1 in a blue for a 1/3 uncommon frog. It says each creature spell you cast costs 1 less to cast if it has mutate. And let me just stop there and note that it does not say you have to be paying the mutate cost. You don't have to actually mutate that creature. It's just if it has the word mutate written on it, if it has the mechanic mutate written on it, you can cast it for 1 less, whether you're actually mutating it or just casting it as a regular creature. In addition to that, the Polywog Symbiote says whenever you cast a creature spell, if it has mutate, draw a card and then discard a card. So you get a forced loot every time you cast a mutate creature. Again, whether you're mutating it or whether you're just throwing it out there as a creature, which is a pretty nice little engine. Again, this makes your mutate cost cheaper, so you can get going pretty quickly with an actual like beater early on, or get an engine going extremely quickly. Just imagine having Symbiote on turn 2, and then on turn 3 you get to cast the Dreamtail Heron. Its normal mutate cost is 3, but the Polywog Symbiote makes it, the normal casting cost is 4, but the Symbiote makes it 3, and just on turn 3, you can have this big mutate engine going already, start attacking for a bunch of damage, and you get the extra loot on top of it. Seems like a very good enabler for the deck. On top of that, there are a couple creatures in this set that are just basically composed of +1/+1 counters. That is Ivy Elemental, Fertilid, and Adaptive Shimmerer. These are creatures that are all base power and toughness 0/0, but they enter the battlefield with +1/+1 counters. And just a note about these cards is that if you mutate onto them, all of the +1/+1 counters will carry over to the final product, right? So if I play Fertilid with 2 +1/+1 counters, and then I mutate onto it, I'm going to mutate that creature on top of Fertilid. It's going to basically override the 0/0. It's going to be whatever it is on top, and it'll still have those +2/+2, or those 2 +1/+1 counters, and Fertilid's ability for what it's worth. And then finally, there's a couple other cards I wanted to mention here. Again, you're just looking for a base. You're looking for a starting point when you get your mutate cards going. If you have to cast your mutate cards as vanilla creatures that you might later mutate onto, it's not the end of the world, but you do want to make sure you have cards in your deck that are designed to kind of get the mutate train rolling, which means you always want to target, and the best kind of targets are things that do something that you don't mind losing later on. Cards like Farfinder and Frostlinks have decent into the battlefield triggers, but after those abilities have resolved a couple turns later, a 1/1 Vigilance or Vanilla 2/2 might not be the most impressive thing on board. You don't necessarily mind losing them, so let them do their work and then use them as the target for your mutate cards. That way you're getting value off of your cards regardless of what happens to your mutate creature. There's also Mysterious Egg, which is a single colorless mana for just an egg creature. It's a 0/2. It's not an artifact. It is just a random colorless creature, and it says whenever this creature mutates, put a +1/+1 counter on it. Again, this was just designed to say, hey, here's a starting point, here's a leaping off point for your mutate cards. Play Mysterious Egg on turn 1, and then on turn 2, 3, 4, cast your mutate creatures onto the egg. You will be down the egg, but you'll be up a +1/+1 counter, and it lets you do your mutate as early as possible, right? Pretty bad top deck later in the game, so don't go crazy. It's not a card that other people will be interested in, but it is a nice starting point for your mutate cards and gives you an extra little bonus for doing so. There's Thieving Otter, which again doesn't directly say anything about mutate, but it's just a good enough card that if you can grant an evasive ability like fly into it, it's going to get you an engine going. Thieving Otter, in this case, is 2 and a blue for a 2/2 that draws a card whenever it deals damage to an opponent. So if you can give that thing flying or make it big enough that your opponent can't effectively block it, you can kind of get carried away with the game. It's very similar to the octopus we saw, just, the common version of that octopus. And then finally, a card that I know I'm going to hate in this format, Wingfold Terron, is 5 and a blue for a 3/6 common dinosaur, and it enters with your choice of a flying counter or a hexproof counter. And the reason I include that here is because this is the only option you have for a hexproof creature in this set, and it's basically the cheese. You give this thing hexproof, and then boom, mutate, 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 and your opponent can't do anything about it. Your opponent can't stop you from mutate, and they can't bounce it in response. They basically can't deal with this card unless they're very far ahead. It's a 6 toughness hexproof creature, and it makes it safe to mutate. So you're going to kind of mitigate, again, that 2-for-1 nature of mutate by just having a creature that your opponent can't interact with. Kind of hate this card. It is going to cheese some people out, but it is expensive enough that it's fair. It's just a card that you should probably keep in mind if you're playing with or against a mutate deck. And that's going to go ahead and do it. Again, very complicated mechanic. I hope I did my best to kind of parse, the benefits and downsides of mutate here. I'm not going as in-depth as one could. One could literally talk about hours, for hours about the corner cases with mutate and all the stuff that happens if you blink it or if you morph it, I don't know, or like you mutate onto a two-sided creature or something like that. It's just a very bizarre, complicated mechanic. It's going to take a little while to get used to, but it's going to be fun, and you kind of need to know the ups and downs of it. So again, if you're in mutate, try to stick to the Sultai colors, but go crazy. I don't know. It's going to be a fun mechanic. So again, thanks for watching. I hope this has been informative. You can subscribe to the channel if you want to see more content like this, or if you want to see Ikoria drafts when they pop up here in a couple days. If you want to find us on Twitter, it's MTG_Manarocks. I'd love to talk to you there. And that's going to go ahead and do it. Next time we'll probably talk about, the graveyard archetypes, and then we want to talk about some of the human archetypes as well. So thanks for watching. My name's Timothy with Manarocks, and I'll see you all next time.